January 1944. The Pacific before dawn is a sheet of dark steel, broken only by the slow breathing of the sea and the distant thunder of engines warming somewhere beyond the horizon. Salt hangs heavy in the air. A low, continuous rumble rolls across the water, too deep to be a storm, too steady to be chance. It is the sound of machinery multiplying itself, of power assembling unseen. For the Japanese sailors scanning the empty horizon, trained to read the sea like scripture, that sound carries an unfamiliar weight. Something vast is coming. The moment matters because by early 1944, the Pacific War has turned decisively. Japan's navy, once the sharp edge of imperial ambition, has been bled by attrition. Midway's carrier losses, the grinding campaigns around Guadalcanal, and relentless American submarine warfare against supply lines. In contrast, the United States has unlocked the full momentum of industrial war. Shipyards on both coasts and in the Great Lakes deliver hulls faster than the ocean can swallow them. The U.S. Navy no longer sails in isolated carrier groups. It moves as task forces, self-contained, mutually supporting systems designed to project air power across thousands of miles. Task Force 58, organized under Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, becomes the clearest expression of this new reality. Multiple fleet carriers, light carriers, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers moving as one organism. Japanese naval doctrine had been shaped by the belief that skill, discipline, and decisive battle could offset material disadvantage. Carrier warfare was not foreign to them. They had pioneered it with daring and precision in 1941. What they expected, even as the tide turned, was parity of method, if not of number. Encounters between comparable forces where courage and training might still decide outcomes. What they experienced instead was scale without precedent. When American carrier task forces appeared, they did not announce themselves with a single silhouette or a lone plume of smoke. They arrived as horizons filled with steel, decks stretched so long they seemed to bend the curvature of the sea. Aircraft did not launch in handfuls, but in waves that folded the sky upon itself. Factual records tell the story in numbers that feel almost abstract until one imagines standing watch. By mid-1944, Task Force 58 did field over a dozen aircraft carriers at once, including Essex-class fleet carriers displacing more than 27,000 tons each when fully loaded, supported by light carriers that added yet more flight decks to the count. In major operations like the Marianas Campaign, American carriers launched more than 900 aircraft in a single day. Japanese after-action reports and post-war interrogations repeatedly note the same astonishment, the apparent inexhaustibility of American air power. Planes shot down in the morning were replaced by afternoon. Losses that would cripple a Japanese formation barely slowed the tempo of American operations. The emotional contrast is sharpest at sea level. Japanese sailors had been taught to think of carriers as precious swords, deadly but fragile, to be unsheathed with care. The American carrier was something else entirely, a floating factory. Flight decks functioned like assembly lines. Aircraft were fueled, armed, launched, recovered, repaired, and launched again with mechanical regularity. The sound became the symbol, the unending roar of engines, the crash of arresting wires, the whistle of catapults. It never stopped. Even at night, when Japanese doctrine favored darkness and silence, American carriers glowed faintly, buzzing with activity, preparing the next day's strikes. Documented observations from Japanese officers after the war speak not of fear alone, but of disorientation. One noted that American task forces seemed to create their own weather, a metaphor born from the clouds of exhaust, smoke, and aircraft that altered the sky itself. Another remarked on the layered defense, radar pickets, combat air patrols, anti-aircraft screens, systems integrated so tightly that an attacker felt absorbed and erased before reaching the heart. Radar, still unevenly deployed in Japanese forces, gave the Americans an invisible reach. The sea no longer hid movement. Surprise, once Japan's greatest weapon, became rare. This experience forced a transformation of perception. For sailors raised on the ethic of sacrifice and the promise of decisive battle, the American task force suggested a different philosophy of war. It was not about a single heroic stroke, but about sustained pressure, logistics, and replacement. The United States did not wager everything on one moment. It manufactured tomorrow in advance. Ideology took material form. Democracy, often caricatured by Japanese propaganda as chaotic and weak, appeared instead as coordinated abundance, many parts moving together without visible strain. The recurring sound of engines returns again and again in accounts because it carried meaning beyond noise. It was proof. Every takeoff declared that fuel was plentiful, pilots trained, machines available. Every landing meant the system absorbed risk and continued. Where Japanese carriers had fallen silent when planes were lost, American decks remained loud. Silence, once a tactical virtue, became a marker of defeat. Operations like the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, the so-called Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, cemented this realization. American carriers, protected by radar-directed fighters and overwhelming anti-aircraft fire, destroyed hundreds of Japanese aircraft for minimal losses. The numbers were devastating, but the psychological impact was deeper. Japanese sailors witnessed not just defeat, but redundancy. There was always another carrier, another squadron, another strike forming beyond sight. By late 1944 and into 1945, as American task forces ranged closer to the Japanese home islands, the symbolism sharpened. The sound of engines offshore meant inevitability. It meant that even the vast Pacific, once Japan's shield, had become a corridor. Abundance moved across it in disciplined formations, sustained by oilers and tenders that extended American reach indefinitely. The task force was not a fleet passing through. It was a mobile society, carrying its own fuel, food, and future. In the end, the stunned reaction of Japanese sailors was not simply awe at size. It was the recognition of a system that could not be exhausted by bravery alone. The carriers embodied an idea that freedom, when organized and resourced, could generate power at scale without collapsing into chaos. The engines faded only when the war ended, but their echo lingered as a lesson written across the Pacific, that in modern war, ideology is measured not just in belief, but in the ability to sustain motion, sound, and purpose without end.